In this video, I'm covering Final Fantasy card evaluation in Draft, providing you with tools and techniques to better evaluate cards so you can draft better decks, win more games, and have more fun playing. Let's dive in. First, we have to discuss the two key questions that you need to ask yourself when evaluating cards. The first is obvious. Is this card strong? We're going to be going through techniques and ways to evaluate cards so you can figure out whether or not the card is strong, worth including, and worth prioritizing in your drafts. The second question is also important though. Where does it belong? Because some cards are strong, but only fit into very narrow archetypes or macro strategies, like they'll only fit into your control decks or only fit into your aggro decks and really shine. And by maximizing your cards, you're going to also be able to build better decks, and that is a part of card evaluation. So we're going to be going through these two key questions, and we're going to talk about the second one first because that one's a little bit easier to answer. And to do that, we're going to look at the Final Fantasy draft archetypes. Now, these are the two-color strategies that are found in the set, and by knowing these, you're going to be better able to look at a card and think, where maybe does this card belong? Does it fit into a control deck, an aggro deck, one of these synergy decks? So red-white is an equipment aggro deck, blue-black is a control deck, green-white is a go-wide deck, which means you get a lot of creatures into play and then have cards that reward you for doing that. Blue-red is a 4+ mana spell deck, so it rewards you for casting non-creature spells that cost 4 or more mana. Black-green is a graveyard value deck, blue-white is an artifacts deck, red-green is a landfall aggro deck, black-white is a sacrifice deck, blue-green is town ramp, so there's certain lands in this set that are called towns, and there are payoffs for having towns in your deck. And then black-red is spell aggro. So there's cards that ping your opponent when you play non-creature spells, and so you have that in an aggro shell. So these are the main archetypes that when you're looking at cards, you should be thinking about as you evaluate those cards. And now let's get into some of the specifics of how to actually evaluate cards. Techniques. The three we're going to be covering are the vanilla test, which is a very good evaluating tool that's quite simple to use, the floor and the ceiling approach, and then quadrant theory, which is the most complex of these, but also very, very useful. So first things first is the vanilla test, which is to simplify a card evaluation by removing frills to just examine raw stats or rate. So if you look at a card like Ahriman, it's 2 and a black for a 2/2 with flying, death touch, and then an activated ability. 3 mana, sacrifice another creature or artifact, draw a card. So there's a lot going on with this card. It's got an activated ability, it's got some stats, and the vanilla test is simply remove any of the frills. So just think of this as a 2 and a black 2/2 with flying and death touch. That's a pretty solid card. It's decent in defensive decks because of the death touch. It's decent in aggressive decks because of the flying ability. And so even if you remove this 3 mana ability, you still have a reasonable card. And adding that ability is just upside. It's a benefit that you get by having the card in your deck. You get to have access to this activated ability, whether or not you really care about it. Now, there is going to be some archetypes that care about it a little bit more. So looking at the homes for this card, we think white-black sacrifice. It's a sacrifice deck. It's a card that lets you sacrifice things. That's really where you might want this card the most. But it also fits into the other strategies well. A red-black deck can take advantage of a 2/2 flyer for 3. A black-green deck can use a defensive creature like a death toucher. And similarly with a blue-black control deck, a flying defensive blocker, it can block anything. It has death touch, it's going to trade. It's going to help you get to that late game. And it's not going to be at its best in those homes. It's not going to really shine outside of that white-black deck maybe. But just evaluating the card without the activated ability is going to help you, because instead of thinking, oh, this card has to go into a sacrifice deck, you can think, oh, this is a 2/2 flying death touch flyer for 3 mana, and so I can just put this into whichever deck maybe needs that stat line. And so that's the key to the vanilla test. Now, the next technique we're going to look at is the floor and ceiling. So you imagine a card in its worst and best scenarios to find its range and general use case. So thinking about the card in a variety of circumstances helps move your brain in the right direction, so you can think about, okay, is this card one that I'll want to include in the general case that's going to fall between the worst and best case scenarios? Now, to do that, as an example, we're going to look at Garnet, Princess of Alexandria. So it's green-white for a 2/2 with lifelink, and whenever Garnet attacks, you remove a lore counter from each of any number of sagas you control, put a +1/+1 counter on Garnet for each lore counter removed this way. So it's got this stuff about the lore counters, which is going to care about sagas and things like that in a green-white deck. Now, when you're looking at the floor, you go back to the vanilla test when it comes to creatures. You think of this, oh, it's a 2 mana 2/2 lifelink, which is just a Mesa Unicorn if you think about it. A 2 mana 2/2 lifelinker is a totally solid card. Sure, it's a little bit harder to cast because it costs green-white instead of just one generic and a white, but 2 mana 2/2 lifelink is just a solid card. And so knowing that that is the floor gives you a good evaluation, because now instead of thinking, oh, I don't have any sagas, I don't have anything that cares about these, like removing counters from sagas, all of a sudden you can just think, okay, at the very baseline, it's a 2 mana 2/2, and that is going to be the worst it ever gets in my deck. Now, if you think about the ceiling, you can combine Garnet, Princess of Alexandria, with something like Summon Fenrir, which is a saga in this set, which is 2 and a green for a 3/2, and then it has all of these abilities that reward you when you put your lore counters on it. So if you play Garnet on turn 2, turn 3, play the Fenrir, all of a sudden you're attacking with Garnet, removing the lore counter, putting a counter on your Garnet, you've got a growing creature, you're constantly triggering that first chapter of your summon Fenrir, the creature's not going to end up sacrificing itself. All of these benefits that you get from having the Garnet, this is a really high ceiling to have on a card because it's a 2-card combo that almost wins you the game if you can just assemble it in the early turns, unless your opponent has a kill spell, because it's really hard to deal with a creature that's growing and also all of the lands you're going to be getting. So this is a high ceiling to have on the card, but when you just evaluate the floor and ceiling as a whole, the card has a very high floor as a 2-mana 2/2 Death Toucher, and it also has a pretty high ceiling above that if you can combine it with some of these sagas. And so the card overall is quite strong because you have both a high floor and an even higher ceiling. And the high floor is really important to this card because the downside of just not having any sagas in your deck isn't even that bad. And looking at the homes for this card, because it's a gold card, it does only fit into that green-white deck, though it is still important to think about homes for multicolored cards because sometimes they're late game cards that you can splash. This card, however, is at its best on turn 2, so you're not going to want to do that. Just think about this as a green, white, gold card, but it's always good to have that little thought of a card. Okay, does it fit into multiple decks? Can I splash it? Things like that, even with these multicolored cards, but this one just fits into this one shell. Now, looking at floor and ceiling again with a non-creature spell, because you can't there's sometimes a little bit more complex to evaluate. We have Auron's Inspiration. So 2 and a white for an instant, attacking creatures get +2/+0 until end of turn, and then you can flash it back for 2 white. So you can potentially do both in the same turn, spread it out across a couple of turns. Now, the floor of this card, if you have no creatures or are unable to attack, this card does nothing. That is a very low floor. If we compare that to the floor of the card we just looked at, of a 2/2 lifelinker for 2, this card has a much lower floor because it doesn't do anything if you can't get any attacking creatures. The ceiling, though, if you have 7 mana, any attackers can get +4/+0, which can win you the game with a wide board state. That's probably the best case scenario for this card. There's also situations where you cast this card for +2/+0 early in the game, and then you cast it later for +2/+0 again and deal a bunch of damage to your opponent, really enable some attacks with this card. But it's not going to, it does have a very high ceiling of being able to do stuff that other cards can't do. It can help you push through board stalls very effectively and things like that. So if we look at the card as a whole with the floor and the ceiling, we can think, okay, the card has a very low floor. It doesn't do anything if I'm not aggressive, but if I have the right shell, it can be a very good card and do unique things that no other card can do. And so the card has some potential, but probably not in as many homes because of that low floor in decks that can't use it properly. And it really does only really, if you think about homes, as far as archetypes are concerned, it really fits into a green-white go wide deck because if you're going wide, you get the maximum benefit from that +2/+0. Though if you do, sorry about that. Though if you do think about it, if you have the right shell for it, some decks that are red-white might have some token generations. Some decks that are black-white might have token generation. There are going to be other decks where you can include it in, but even though this is a mono-white card, it doesn't really fit into every single white deck, especially the ones that aren't going to have a ton of creatures or have other synergies they're trying to enable, so they're not going to have room for a card like Auron's Inspiration. Now moving on to quadrant theory, which is the final of the 3 techniques we're going to be covering here, and that is to evaluate a card in 4 stages of the game to determine its overall effectiveness. The 4 stages of the game are developing, which is the early turns of the game, so like turns 1 through 4, when you're just playing your early creatures, deploying cards that are mostly from your opening hand. The second stage is when you're ahead. If you've gotten off to a quick start and your opponent's maybe stumbled, that is the ahead stage of the game. Behind, the opposite, your opponent's gotten off to a quick start, maybe you've stumbled, things like that. And then parity, when you're in a board stall and both kind of in top deck mode. And so those are the 4 quadrants to look at a card when you're evaluating it. And a card that's really interesting to evaluate with this technique is Balam T-Rexasaur, which is 4 green for a 6/6 trampler. When this creature enters, you gain 3 life, and it has forest cycling for 2 mana. So you can discard it, search your library for a forest, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle. And so with quadrant theory, we're going to look at this card in those 4 quadrants we just mentioned. When you're developing, it isn't an ideal card to cycle, but forest cycling does give it more relevance than most 6-drops. So a lot of the time, your 6-drop can't do anything in the developing stage of the game, but Balam T-Rexasaur does actually have some upside there, because if you are going to miss a land drop, you can cycle the T-Rexasaur if you want. So that is better than most 6-drops, but it's still not an ideal card for if you're thinking about cards you want in your opening hand, which is the developing stages a lot of the time, then the T-Rexasaur isn't really what you want there, but it isn't a complete blank there. If you're ahead, it's a giant creature that can't be chump blocked because of the trample, so it will help you finish the game quickly. So this card is good if you're ahead, though it isn't like a killer card if you're ahead because it is like a 6-drop. So it's not going to be a card you can always deploy when you're trying to punish an opponent from stumbling, but it is a card that if you are ahead and you have 6 mana, this card's going to be one you're happy to have. If you're behind, it is expensive to cast, so it's vulnerable if your opponent has a removal spell or a tap spell, but a giant blocker that gains you some life is good for stabilizing, so this card, especially for a common, is pretty good when you're behind. And then there is parity, which a giant creature that can help you break a board stall. So just having expensive cards, they tend to be better in parity, because if you're in top deck mode, top decking a 6-drop with trample and gaining you some life is going to be pretty good. So if you think about it overall in terms of quadrant theory, it's pretty good in all the quadrants, and that means it's a pretty good card overall. Cards that are good when you're behind are more important. That's the most important quadrant. This card does pretty well there because of that life gain attached to it and being a good blocker. And being ahead, having cards that are good in that quadrant is the least important, because if you're ahead, most cards are going to do the trick. So just think about that as an extra level to quadrant theory. And when cards are good in multiple quadrants, that tends to be a good sign. Though if a card is really, really good in one quadrant, like really, really good in the developing stages of the game, then that can also be a benefit, because if you have a card that's like very aggressive, then that card can maybe only be good in one particular quadrant, but you build your deck to maximize that card, or you build your deck to have all cards that are good in the developing stage of the game, and then you can leverage that as well. So that's how quadrant theory is going to be applied. Next up are homes for Balam T-Rexosaur. It's probably going to be at its best in black, green, or blue, green, the more defensive decks that are more likely to get to 6 mana and be able to play this card and care about the life gain aspect of it. Black, green might care about having it go to the graveyard for graveyard synergies or things like that with the forest cycling early, but also red, green can use it as just a top-end threat. Green, white can use it as a top-end threat, even if it won't be at its best there. So even a card that does well in the quadrants still has homes that you need to consider and where you might want to take your draft if you have Balam T-Rexosaur. Moving on, remember, context is an important aspect of card evaluation. You always need to think about these cards, even if you think it's good in a lot of situations, the context is still going to matter, and your individual deck that you are drafting is going to matter for when you are taking a card. And yeah, for practice, I have chosen Call the Mountain Chocobo, which I want you to look at, is this card good and where does it belong, using the tools that we mentioned, and leave that in the comments section down below so you can practice this and get some feedback from me on your thoughts. Call the Mountain Chocobo is 3 and a red for a sorcery. Search your library for a mountain card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. Create a 2/2 green bird creature token with whenever a land you control enters. This token gets +1/+0 until end of turn, and then flashback for 5 and a red. Anyway, that is going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe for more, and comment if you have any questions or feedback. And to let me know you made it all the way to the end, leave #cardprep, and then, of course, your practice on the Call the Chocobo card. So that's going to do it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it. Good luck in your Final Fantasy events, and I'll talk to you next time.